So, welcome back to the third faction overview for the new build of Third Age Reforged, and to the last, at least partially new faction. This is kind of a half new faction, and that is of course the Wild Men of DUNLAND. They were in the game previously, of course, but they were really more of an afterthought, really a cobbled together hodgepodge of a couple of unique units, but most of what they had was taken from other factions, especially Isengard and Rudauer. But that is no longer the case. There is only one unit which they now share with another faction in their overlords in Isengard. The rest of their roster is completely their own, so they now stand very much as they are today. And in all fairness, they have actually retained a lot of the same strengths that they had when they weren't a particularly, well thought out faction in many ways, just like I said, cobbled together from many other bits and pieces from the bargain bin from other factions, but they have managed to retain what identity they did build while they were in that state, and they are now a very different proposition altogether. And Dunland's story, of course, one of, you could view it as injustice earlier on in their history, but in the modern day, they are very much just the lackeys and the henchmen of powers bigger than themselves. In many ways, 2 layers down from the Dark Lord through Saruman, and then they have them being used as strongmen in the invasion for Rohan and the attempted pacification of the central plains of Middle-earth. But we'll see what Dunland can do in your hands, and we'll go through some of their strengths and weaknesses right now. And the first one is fairly clear, although perhaps it's worth mentioning a little bit more so even among many of the other Evil Men factions, and that is their very high numbers. Indeed, the army sizes that Dunland can field are perhaps something to rival factions like Mordor or even the Misty Mountains when it comes to the sheer amount of units that they can get out onto the field. This is a little bit less extreme, I think, than it was back when they were, again, that cobbled together mess of units from other factions. Now it's not quite as well pronounced as that, but it's still a huge part of what they do, and this isn't too strange when it comes to looking at the evil factions and what their strengths actually are. But it is worth bearing in mind with Dunland, because you will need to lean on that. We will get on to a couple of things later on when it comes to their downsides, but numbers are very much one of those things that you're going to have to use, and you're going to have to try and maintain throughout the battle as well, because if it does start to get away from you, that's where you can run into some problems. But you do have a bit of margin for error with the amount of casualties that you can take, which is useful on the open field. Certainly it's useful in a siege as well, attack and defence, as long as you can engage in a bit of organised chaos with your numbers as well. You can very much pull things to your advantage. And speaking of which, when it comes to organised chaos, and I do use the word organised pointedly because the second of their strengths do rely really on you being able to defend certain units within your roster, and that is your close to mid-range projectile units. Now, there are factions with better crossbows than Dunland, and there are factions with better throwing projectiles than Dunland, but there aren't really any other factions in the game that manage to combine the two in the way that they do, which means there's effectively a kill radius around their army, which is pretty potent for anyone that comes into it. So as soon as you are in that danger zone, you're almost forced to engage with the rest of their army, and they're able to punish certain factions for doing that more so than others. But we have a really good mix. I've already mentioned the crossbows, and these tend to be their highest tier units as well, so as much as they don't have the very best crossbows in the game, it's still one of the very important units that Dunland have at the heart of their identity, both on horseback and on foot. But also their close projectiles, their throwing projectiles, they've got access to every class of them, I believe, with javelins, throwing axes and slings at their disposal, some being more important to their identity than others, and like I said, a few of their fellow Evil Men factions do this a little bit better, but combining it with those crossbows at mid-range means that you have a really consistent amount of damage you're able to do out to a certain point. And speaking of which, once you get into that certain point, there is a class of unit which Dunland do pretty well against, and part of that is those projectiles I just mentioned. Part of it is the classes of units that they have in melee, and that is that they are good anti-cavalry combatants as a general rule, and this shouldn't be too surprising given the fact that their mortal rivals are Rohan, who pride themselves on their cavalry, so it makes a lot of sense that Dunland would develop tactics, weaponry, and expertise, really, in fighting off against these certain units. It makes them pretty handy in this sort of battle on the open field. However, you're going to have to be a little bit careful when it comes to taking charges still, because Dunland, as with most other Evil Men factions, can be susceptible to shock. So as much as you do have anti-cavalry damage as a bit of a strength of your faction, you are going to need to again engage in that organised chaos. Try and break your opponent's lines into bits and then use some of your high damage units up close, but you need to be careful that things don't get too chaotic so that the enemy can start really getting those lances into your soft, vulnerable underbelly. But you should have all of the tools at your disposal to make that a very dicey endeavour for whoever is trying to do it. Speaking of which, however, we will move on to some of the downsides of playing as Dunland, and I think many of these won't come as too much of a shock given what I've already said and given the identity of Dunland as a whole, but they do bear talking about, and the first is going to be low defence scores across the board. They have very high numbers, but as a general rule, you can have low armour, high melee defence, you can have high armour with not so much melee defence, and you can try and have your bulky units like that, but Dunland, they don't really have good defensive values, comparatively speaking, across the board. Their armour scores are reasonably low, even at the high end of their faction, and when it comes to their melee defense as well, many of their more impressive melee units certainly lean more heavily on damage, and generally speaking as well, with their heavier focus on units that are going to be skirmishing in close quarters, they're going to have numbers, they're going to have spears and pikes. If you do start taking a lot of damage, it can be a pretty slippery slope, and a lot of your units can start falling away very, very quickly. This also extends to things at long range, which we'll get onto in just a moment, but overall you're going to have to be quite careful when it comes to maintaining the lives of your men if things start getting away from you quickly. You can take a lot of casualties and still be competitive because of those high numbers, but the low defences means that you can start to tip over the cliff, as it were, towards the end of a battle more quickly than you would like if you're not careful. The next option, or the next negative that we're going to be looking at, is going to be the limited quality options. I did slightly touch on this when we were talking about Dunland's strengths, but they don't really have much at the extreme high end that is going to be a real showstopper of a unit. They've got some very good crossbows at the high end, and that is, like I said, the most high quality units they have. They've got some good examples of really damaging units, good armour piercing as well. Again, other factions might do that a little bit better, but it's still something Dunland can call upon. But when it comes to trying to get yourself over the line, particularly in a very close game towards the end, relying on your quality up close and that sort of thing, Dunland could struggle. That in terms of their bodyguard tier units, they have possibly, in terms of sheer quality and stats, certainly in melee, some of the weakest that the game has to offer. But they do get around that in other ways, as we've already briefly touched on. And finally, as we slightly touched on as well with the low defense scores, long-range skirmishing is not really their forte either. They've got one archer unit, it's fairly lightly armoured and numerous. You can use it to decent effect to at least engage in that sort of warfare if you want, but you're never really going to be winning battles at long ranges. You're going to have to close the gap and use those closer range skirmishers to soften the enemy up, and then try and use your numbers and some of your damaging units to finish them off while your anti-cavalry units protect you from any sort of rally from your opposition, and that really is the key. Long-range skirmishing is something that a lot of people do like to fall back on, but Dunland is not really the faction that is for you if that is how you want to approach your battles. Again, they're not completely defenceless in that regard, but you're not going to be winning any battles with it. You're only going to be competing in that arena and then relying on other things to get you over the line. So, that's a sort of generalised overview of what Dunland are all about as a faction, but now let's head over to the grassy plain and see what they actually have in their roster up close. So here we have Dunland's roster strewn out across the field, and it's a little bit of a difficult one to quantify actually in some respects, with some of their units and tiers and costings being a little bit interesting, but we'll get onto that in a moment. But the first thing that we will talk about as well is this is the first faction that we've seen so far where there are visual changes when you upgrade the armour of your units, which is a little bit interesting considering it's not really Dunland's forte, as we talked about in the strengths and weaknesses section. But I suppose with Ered Luin and the Rovanian, they already, for their heavily armoured units, are already rocking the best of what their peoples can make, whereas with Dunland, it's cobbling stuff together, and if you can strap on a little bit more where you find it, you will. And we'll start off with such a unit right now, as we speak about a unit which has been in the game ever since Vanilla Third Age, and that is the Dunlandic Clansmen. Back then, a part of Isengard, now a part of their own faction. And you can see here, this is the standard variant. And then the armour upgraded version, it's not the most striking of armour upgrades, as we will speak about when we go through the other factions in the game, you know, in the sense that they're only really wearing a sort of leather and steel cap, as it were, to try and give them just a little bit of extra bulk, which, to be fair, as a force multiplier for 253 men is not the worst thing. After all, a little bit of extra defence spread out across that many units can make the difference between life and death in a battle. You can see the difference as well as we flick back to the other one. One armour value higher is what you'll get here. Recruitment cost is of course very low, but it's not as low as some of the very worst units that the game has to offer in terms of stats anyway. Stuff like the Fodder from Mordor or the Goblins from the Misty Mountains. The Dunlanding clansmen have a little bit over them, and they're still a very, very numerous unit. And this is one of those units as well which helps you have that sort of hedgehog feeling against cavalry, because even your very lowliest units are pretty decent when it comes to doing damage against cavalry like this, but you know, the numbers are really the main thing here. They can do skill trom as well, which is actually a fairly rare formation in Third Age. You know, you can sort of set up those discs of units if you want to. I mean, it's a more difficult formation to use, I think, effectively in Third Age these days than something like Shield Wall for guarding in chokes, but it's still something interesting which you can deploy as and when you could use it. I mean, obviously the attack score is very low, so when it comes to dealing damage against, you know, other units of infantry, it's really going to be, you know, mob rules here with these guys. They're going to have to try and overwhelm their opposition with sheer numbers, because 2 is obviously not going to suffice, and a charge bonus of 1 is as low as it can get. Now we move on to the unit which they share with Isengard, and that is going to be the Uruk-hai Raiders. And these guys actually represent Dunland's option when it comes to a standard line infantry unit, and it does go to show some of the gaps that they do have in their roster as a result. I mean, many of the other factions, even the Orcish ones, are going to have access to a better unit of dedicated line infantry than this. It's a similar story actually to the Rovanian that we just talked about in the last faction overview, where they don't have any sort of option for a sword and board style unit. At least Dunland do have that. 450 is a decently low cost for a unit which is going to have 253 men in it, or 253 Uruk-hai in it, and the stats aren't bad, honestly, in comparison to similar types of units for similar costs from the other Orcish factions that they could have on loan. The Uruk-hai Raiders are among the best at doing this sort of job, and it's an important one for Dunland as well, because as we go through the rest of their roster in terms of their infantry units, in terms of what they're capable of doing, it is going to be a bit of a mixed bag in that regard. And speaking of which, this is kind of a hybrid unit. We have the Dunish warband here. Now, I wasn't really sure how to quantify these guys. I put them in with the infantry. Obviously, they do have, first and foremost, a missile attack, and that is their slings. So this is one of the examples of close-range projectiles that they do have. As with most slings, the missile attack is only 2, but it is an armour-piercing 2. So if you get some consistent line of shots onto decently armoured units, you're still going to do a good amount of damage. In melee, if you compare them, I mean, they have the same cost. They are overall a little bit worse defensively, but actually a little bit better in terms of their attack scores, and that comes largely down to their choice of weapon being an axe. So not giving up too much in terms of their capabilities in melee, while also having that pretty handy sling damage, is going to be very useful. They do lose, however, around 50 men per unit, so it is an interesting call to make. I think you're always going to see Dunish Warband as part of the Dunland makeup, just because they're going to have that efficiency of dealing damage at long range, and they're not really that much worse than the other options up close and personal when it comes to really filling out your army with numbers. But it's just a case of how heavily you lean into them and how many of the Uruk-hai Raiders you want to help pad out your, I'm going to obviously bulkier front line, but as we've already talked about, defensive scores are not really Dunland's forte when you consider total defense of 13, and the shield is the biggest contributor to that. You always have to be a little bit worried about how your mainline units are going to hold up when the going gets really tough. But yeah, one of the examples as well of ranged units, which we will continue later on. Now for the other unit that has a visual distinction when it comes to their armour upgrade, the Dunlanding Pikemen, a very important part of the Dunland roster as well, because any faction that's going to struggle when it comes to their defensive scores up close are going to need to have some way of either shortening the fight with pure damage or mitigating the effectiveness of enemy units up close. One way that Dunland can do that is to lean heavily on their pikes to try and keep those units at arm's length. I mean, you can see the stats of pikes are always going to be a little bit skewed because of what they are, but obviously shield value of 0 and an armor value of 3, although that does increase to 4 if you upgrade their armor and they don their helms just like the clansmen just in front of them. It's going to make a little bit of a difference, but ultimately it's no substitute for the shielded pikes that we've already mentioned in the past. They're still going to get massacred by arrow fire, and it's going to be one of the main things that enemy units are going to be targeting down as well, because not only are they a problem for enemy infantry to try and march through, but they're also one of the dangers and one of the contributors to the anti-cavalry capabilities that Dunland have across their faction. So you can lean on them, but just be cautious of the fact that quite a lot of opposition are going to be targeting these guys down to try and leave you just that little bit more vulnerable, but they are an important building block in your army. Speaking of which, Dunland's better dedicated infantry units, unsurprisingly, are kind of savage and are much more built for dealing damage and trying to kill off enemy units quickly, and we start off with the Ravenborn. I put them in their own tier, even though they're only a little bit more expensive than the units just in front of them, because they are pretty distinct, and a bonus fighting against cavalry in addition to having the armor piercing of a big two-handed axe makes them pretty dangerous. I mean, this is one of the things that mark Dunland out, the fact that even units like this have got an extra bonus against fighting cavalry. Already heavy axemen are pretty good when it comes to sheer melee capabilities, so you really don't want to be hanging around with your horsemen for too long against these guys. And when you look at their stats, this is a big step up. I mean, in terms of their defensive values, I mean, even their armor is actually pretty decent. Their chainmail is a little bit heavier than the furs and chain shirts that the units just in front of them are wearing. Their defensive skill is pretty low, but then that's not too odd for a heavy axeman unit, but it's really the attack score where you start to see a big uptick here. A charge bonus of 15 and a base attack of 17 is big, and when you have the bonuses of either fighting a cavalry unit or an armoured unit, that's one way that you can really start to ratchet up the pressure on the opposition. I mean, they're not that numerous though, 133, so you do have to look after them to a certain extent because they are one of the more important units in your roster. Yeah, big damage. And then, moving on, the most expensive dedicated infantry unit that Dunland have. They're sort of crouching in the grass here, but you can see the antlers and the sort of classic berserker nature of them, the Beastmen of Dunland, and they are a berserker class unit. They're a little bit different to the others in the sense that most of the others in the game, as we saw previously with the tribal berserkers of the Rovanian, and as we will see in the future, they all tend to be, again, fairly savage looking units but with a two-handed weapon. These guys sort of outfit themselves with animal claws instead, so I mean it's a different look, but ultimately they are going to fill the same sort of role in the sense that their attacking stats are extremely high, their defensive stats are pretty damn low, and it's going to be their hit points which keep them alive. So as soon as those 3 hit points are gone, they're going to melt away pretty quickly. I mean, especially when you consider the armor score is only 2, that's low even for berserkers standards. So if you get caught out in the open against enemy archers, they are going to really try and target you down. The fact that you can hide anywhere means that on an open field the enemy can't do that to you immediately. This is a real power spike that Dunland have in melee, and it's one area that they do need to lean on, because as I've mentioned before, Dunland have a quite unique mix of different strengths that many of the other Evil Men factions have. They sort of combine many different aspects from a lot of their peers in that regard, but they don't do any one of them as well, so it's about trying to find that good balance. But the Beastmen of Dunland really are a bit of a hammer blow to the enemy if they're committed at the right time. Really not the easiest thing to withstand, given a charge bonus of 30 is absolutely gigantic for a unit of infantry. So as much as they are pretty uniquely vulnerable once their hit points are gone, while those hit points are still up and available to them, they are going to do tons of damage. Now then, moving on to the dedicated skirmishers, we shall start off with what is effectively a militia tier skirmisher, again crouching in the grass. Only 350 will get you a unit of ruffians, previously the bandits. Really cheap javelins. We've already mentioned in the past how they can be very effective for you as long as they're used in the right way. If they're getting charged by cavalry, it's a problem. It's one of the few units which Dunland have which are going to be really wary of cavalry units coming their way. But again, in a siege, when you've got all of these numbers around you, they're a very efficient unit in this sort of situation, especially when they're on the attack, just because they're such a pain for defenders to have to deal with. Melee stats are obviously not particularly fantastic. If they get caught out in melee early, they're not going to do particularly great job for you, but if they use up all their javelins and then get into melee, ultimately that is still 200 warm bodies that you're throwing at the enemy, and Dunland are not lacking for numbers, as we've said previously. But other than that, a fairly unremarkable unit. Yeah, missile attack of 4, so they're only barely better than, well, they're twice as good as slingers at doing armor-piercing damage, I suppose, but slingers are able to chuck out their damage a little bit quicker than these guys. But again, real battle situations are always a little bit variable in that regard. This is the one unit of archers that Dunland have available to them, the Dunish Huntsman. Missile attack of 5 is honestly not too bad, but you know, their lower armor scores against especially the Western Kingdoms of men that are all around them are going to be a little bit more of a concern for them. Like I said, they're not too dissimilar from their overlords in Isengard in this regard, where they can contest at long range. They do have the tools to be able to do that, but as we mentioned, they're not going to be able to win battles at long range, really. You're going to have to depend on other things, and if you close up just a little bit closer, after all, I've already mentioned how potent they can be in that regard, and we're getting on to some of the best units at doing that particular job right now. The Dunish Huntsmen, I can see them being in most Dunland armies just to give them that option, just so they're not completely defenceless at long range, but it really is a unit here to try and do a job, rather than one to try and win battles. But I kind of like their look, though. You know, kind of bulky, you know, woodland peoples. Now then, another unit which is crouching in the grass, we have the Half-Orc Axe Guard, so the throwing axemen that Dunland have available to them. Missile attack of 12. The base attack damage of throwing axes is very high. They don't have the armor piercing that slings or javelins have, but the base attack is often good enough to do the job. Anyway, I think as well throwing axemen are subject to having their damage mitigated by shields from the front, so that is something that you need to be on the lookout for. But yeah, these guys, extremely damaging. 163 throwing axes coming your way is going to give many units a very bad day indeed, and their stats are honestly not too bad in melee either, compared to many of the other units we've seen. In fact, they might even be considered a hybrid unit, just like the Dunish Warband as well. Again, they're not going to win any prizes with regards to quality, but based on the standards of the army, they are at least able to stand up for themselves, and that shouldn't be too surprising. I mean, the Half-Orcs of Isengard, they are wearing maybe slightly more cobbled together attire from Orthanc, but it's still bits and pieces of Isengard's plate nonetheless, and that is going to give them their armor score of 8, which gives them a little bit more rigidity, especially with their shield value, so they're going to be able to stand up to arrow fire a little bit better than many of the other close range projectiles. But if you do come under arrow fire, you're still going to want to move them forward and start using their payload as quickly as you can. Now, the first out and out bodyguard unit, you would say, they don't have any infantry bodyguard units. I put them on the same tier as the Beastmen, but you wouldn't really put your general in the Beastmen. I don't think they're more of an out and out aggressive unit. We have the Ravenborn Wardens. These guys, crossbowmen, 2 hit points, decent defensive stats as well for the kind of unit that they are. Again, they are crossbows first and foremost, and then spearmen in melee. They can actually make shield wall as a formation as well, so an interesting hybridization of a unit this. But like I said, they are going to be using their crossbows first, and as we mentioned, while they are decent in melee, those 2 hit points and the defensive stats are not terrible, you know, the melee stats as well, given the spears, they are subject to the spear malice, but you know, it's not too bad. But compared to other bodyguard units in melee, this is not really going to be how you're going to win your battles. You're going to need to use those bolts to their maximum effectiveness. But bodyguard crossbows are a real rarity in the game, so it's something that Dunland will be wanting to lean on more often than not. Yeah, but defensively, outside of those 2 hit points compared to other bodyguard units, a little bit lacking. Good enough, but lacking. 1100 is also fairly cheap for a bodyguard unit though as well, so you might be tempted to go into the red limit, but there might be another variant of this later on that we see that you would be more tempted to. And now, as we spoke about a unit of militia javelins, this is kind of a unit of militia cavalry, if we can see them through the flowers on the grassy plain. The Wolves of Dunland. Weapon type cannot be upgraded, but yeah, we have seen a little bit of this where it's sort of like Hounds style units. Charge bonus of 5, I mean their armour is 0, their shield is 0, they're going to fall away pretty quickly. But charging in, doing disruption, you know, 300, they're pretty quick for a unit that only costs 300 as well. Combining them with the rest of your fast movers, doing a bit of harassment. There is a little bit of an art, I think, to using the wolves, but it's a unique kind of unit, and there is a time and a place for them. They're not going to be the heavy hitters that some of the other units that we've already seen and will go on to see are. But having a unit of 120 which can clatter into the enemy and really start causing some chaos, it's really not the worst thing in the world. They can hide as well. And one thing I will say, which is kind of not really anything to do with them as a unit, but they are a bit of a nightmare when it comes to trying to position them on a battlefield, because their formation is set in stone and they are very widely spread. So if you want to put them inside a settlement, good luck when you're on the defence, because you're going to struggle to fit them in, basically. Now, moving on to a more standardised unit of cavalry, not all that much more, however, in terms of cost, we have the Dunnish Hill Riders. Now, as far as a cavalry unit goes, they're fairly unremarkable. They're cheap at 500. Their defensive score is pretty lowly, so if they do come into contact with certainly anti-cavalry cavalry, or if they get under sustained missile fire, they are going to fall away fairly quickly. But if you can get some good charges off with them, it won't take that long before they start to really pay for themselves. And a bonus fighting cavalry as well, which again fits in with the Dunland theme. It's not really, it's a bonus to an attack of 4 ultimately, which means it's not going to be enough to really give them the ability to take on like really hard-hitting sword cavalry or the wargs, for example. But it's just another little extra thing where cavalry is going to take a little bit more damage against these guys than you would have expected. Building on top of everything else Dunland have at their disposal, that is something to bear in mind. But yeah, like cavalry, you need to keep them moving. A few good charges though, and they will pay for themselves, and they are a numerous cavalry unit as well. So they're not going to completely fall away that quickly. And then over here we have the mounted version of the Ravenborn Wardens. Mounted crossbows are not completely unheard of in the game anymore. It used to be that it was just the mercenary crossbows, but now a few factions have access to them. But in terms of the single strongest example of mounted crossbows, this is it. In terms of, they're the only bodyguard tier mounted crossbow unit that the game has to offer. Again, decent defensive stats, decent melee stats as well, because of course they are expected to be able to face off against cavalry in melee, so they are really good cavalry hunter units. If you can combine them, especially in a team game, with another faction that has really strong cavalry, you can really achieve cav dominance just because of Dunland's ability to counteract the enemy forces, and then perhaps your ally can come in and really be the hammer. But again, that's in team-based situations. When it comes to being on your own as Dunland against your opposition, still, in terms of hunting down individual units, these guys can be very good at that. Even if they're on foot, if you do establish a bit of a beachhead, if you get your army into a position where your close-range projectiles, mid-range, and your infantry are causing problems for the enemy, you're not being held at arm's length, and you're really getting in there, the Ravenborn Wardens can deliver surgical strikes to the enemy, I think, which can be pretty devastating. And obviously the punch that crossbows have, missile attack of 12, they are going to hit hard. Armor-piercing projectiles as well. And finally, they're not the only faction to have this either, so this is a shared unit as well, but with artillery it's not too surprising. A few of the other Evil Men factions have access to this, which is the Barbarian Catapult. And really the thing is that it's a standard catapult, we all know how they work, potentially very deadly, a little bit more of a lottery with this than it is with the Ballista, for example, but maybe a little bit more reliable than something like the Trebuchet, which can be a little bit wacky, or certainly the Mangonel. Area attack, big damage. 900 is not the worst cost for a unit that can really do an awful lot of damage. But 203 men in the unit, and they have got those long weapons as well, which cavalry is one of the main things that will try and get in amongst your artillery usually. And this is just another feather in the cap, really, of Dunland being able to defend themselves against such things better than most, because you want to keep your artillery up and running for as long as possible if you're going to invest the money into it. One thing I will say is that there are artillery crews which, in the situation where your artillery does nothing, these barbarians are not going to be able to pay for themselves in terms of 900 gold sunk, generally. Other units can give that a better go, but it's still an example of a unit which, in the past, obviously artillery crews have been next to useless, so it's not quite as much of a concern as it used to be, even for a unit like this. And ultimately it's another 203 soldiers that you have in what is already going to be a very large army indeed. So there we have it. There are Dunland at long last. They've been kind of hovering around in the game for quite a long time. In the last version of the game, they were a faction you could pick, albeit cobbled together, like I said. Prior to that, I think they were kind of like a hidden faction, which we did see crop up occasionally, but it was not really intended for them to be used. Now, however, they have finally arrived as something in their own right, which is good to see. Obviously, they had all of the tools available to make the faction, and so it was maybe a little bit less of a grueling endeavour to create these guys than it was Ered Luin or the Rovanian, but it's good to see them here nonetheless. Obviously, a very well-known part of the Middle-earth mythos as well, especially in the time period which concerns Reforged. So, that is all of the completely new and partially new factions in 0.98, so we will now move on to the factions that we have seen before, but as I've already mentioned, because of the trimming of all the rosters and because of some of the various changes that we have seen, there are a lot of changes to all of the factions that have been in the game for a while now, and we will start off with probably one of the most well-known factions in the game, and we will go with the Kingdom of Gondor when it comes to revisiting all of the factions of old. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.